it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and we are putting our 2025 Block of the Month quilt together today. Hopefully you've been following along and making your blocks, but if not, that's totally fine. Come along for this journey as well. Now, if you haven't squared up your blocks yet, now's the time to do it. Squaring up blocks is the thing that you want to do very last, right before you put your whole quilt together. If you square up as you go along, there can be like differences in moisture in the air that can actually cause like shrink or kind of a growth of your quilt blocks. It sounds weird, I know, but and as you get better at quilting throughout the year, your seam allowance might change a little bit. So what you actually want to square your blocks up to can change. I have a video that is perfect for squaring up. It gives all the tips and tricks for getting everything squared up. So if you want to get these squared up to 12.5 inches, I'm going to go ahead and link that video down below, and you can follow along on that video and learn all the tips and tricks to get your blocks squared up to 12.5 inches. And then we're going to go and put this quilt together. So let's get started. Hey there, quilty friend, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and we're here. We made it to month 12. We've made all 12 blocks. We are ready to put this together to make a quilt. So excited. Okay, so I have all my pieces cut, and interesting to note, so there is the sashing, the small sashing, then there are the medium sashing, and then there are the long sashing pieces, and then there's the shorter and longer border pieces. Now, sashing is also border 1. When we make a quilt, sashing is what goes between the blocks. Not all quilts have sashing, that's totally fine. And then the first row around the blocks is often the same as the sashing. Doesn't have to be, isn't always, but in this case absolutely is. And so we call that border 1 because it goes all the way around. And then border 2 is this nice dark that's really going to frame this quilt. This is a linen blend fabric, so it's actually a little longer. It's more than 40 inches with the fabric, and so we actually only needed 5 strips of this linen blend to make our make enough for our borders, our outer border, our border 2. There we go, our border 2. So that's actually a little less sewing. In order to make these, we've sewn them together end to end and then cut them to the right length. So I did all my pre-cutting ahead of time, got this all put together, and now we're ready to start adding our sashing pieces. So I've laid this out just a little different so you can see how this starts to look as we add this sashing. We're going to put a sashing piece between every single one of the blocks in the rows. So we're not putting them on either end, we're just putting them in the middle. Now, sewing a quilt top is not a lot different than sewing quilt blocks. It's just bigger. So we're going to sew this into a row, this into a row, this into a row, this into a row. We have 4 rows. And when we press, we're going to press towards this center. Oh, I can see how much those blocks are really popping with this sashing fabric that I picked. Okay, so we're going to sew all our rows, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do our sashing. Our sashing between the rows. There is a special technique when we do that, so we're going to talk about that when we get there, but I'm just going to go ahead and get started in putting these rows together. Now I'm putting this sashing to this block, and I'm making sure that it's correct with right sides together and on the correct side of the block. I'm just going to flip this over, and I'm flipping it over because I want the seams to be on top, because then there's less chance of them doing a flippy on my machine while I'm sewing. There we go. Okay, I've turned this into rows, so we have all of our rows sewn together with the sashing pieces in between, and now we're going to start on these long sashing pieces, the horizontal sashing pieces, and we're going to put on all the horizontal sashing pieces, but we are also at the same time going to go ahead and put on that top and bottom border 1, and we'll do that because it's easier to do now as we're putting the rows together, because then we can stitch this to this, this to this, this to the one that goes here, the bottom row to the one above it, and then the bottom row also to the one underneath it. And that way, instead of trying to wrestle this whole top through our machine and on our table, we don't have to. We're just attaching it to a single row, or to, in the case of the bottom one, a single row with one stashing piece already on it. And that just makes it easier. When writing instructions, it's way easier to write the instructions the way that they're written. So that's why the instructions are written this way. But you're watching the video, so you get the extra tip of let's go ahead and attach the sashing pieces as well as the border one pieces on the top and bottom, just like there's some of those horizontal sashing pieces. Now let's talk about how to attach a long sashing piece like this so that it is exactly perfect across the entire row. For this, we're going to want some pins. So I went ahead and grabbed my pin cushion out, and you're going to start by taking the sashing piece right sides together with your row and pinning at both ends. And I don't pin the direction that the seam is going to go. I pin up and down, so perpendicular to the seam. It's going to make the pins easier to pull out, and I also feel like it makes it more accurate. It keeps it from shifting. Now I'm going to take both the pinned row with the sashing strip and just fold it in half. And you could do this before pinning, but I'll often just do it while pinning. I find it easier. And I'm going to find the middle of both like this and go ahead and give them a pin. Now the reason that we're pinning instead of just putting them both together like we did with the short sashing strips is that there's feed dogs on the bottom of the presser foot. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a second. I'm going to add a couple pins here in the middle. So the reason that we're pinning is because there's feed dogs on the sewing machine that pull the fabric from the bottom, but on the top there's a presser foot, and that presser foot is pushing down. So with the presser foot pushing down and the feed dogs pulling through, the top and bottom fabrics aren't exactly going through at the same rate. You can get some slippage between the two fabrics, and it's not as noticeable with short pieces, or you can kind of catch it as it's happening with short pieces as you're lining it up. But with longer pieces like this, you don't really realize it till you're at the end, and one of the, either the sashing or the blocks are longer than the other, or one is short. It just gets wonky. So this makes it so much easier to have everything line up just right. If there's any difference, if your row isn't quite exactly the same length as your sashing piece, it allows you to ease the difference in to the sashing piece. So for this, even though I'm not a pinner, you definitely want to pin in this step. All right, so let's go ahead and take this to the machine. And because it's pinned, it should be super easy for us to go ahead and just stitch this up. Now I really should have done this with the sashing on the bottom and the block on the top. I didn't think about flipping it, but I really should have, and I will when I sew all the other rows, so that's okay. I'm going to keep stitching this one, and then I will go ahead and stitch one more sashing piece to the top of every single row, and then that bottom row is also going to get that border one on the bottom. And then we're going to come back and press and talk about how to attach these rows to one another. It's coming together. Okay, so we have our rows and our sashing, but we need to connect each row and sashing to the one above it. And when we do that, one of the things that we really want is we want these vertical sashings to match up from one to the next. Now with a really busy fabric like I picked for the sashing for this one, it isn't immediately obvious if it's off just by a little bit, but there is a trick that will help us in getting all of these to line up, and we're going to need our trusty marking pen again. So go ahead and get your trusty marking pen out, and I'm going to show you how to do this. So we're going to grab a ruler and our marking pen, and the ruler just needs to be longer than 3¼ inches, which is what this is right here. And we're going to line this up with the edge of our quilt block and the edge of our sashing. So we're lining it up with that seam right there. And if everything is square, one of these lines across the ruler here should also line up with this seam right here. And then we're going to give ourselves a mark in the seam allowance edge here, so you can make the mark 1/4 inch. Now, of course, mine happens to be right where there is a dark bit of this fabric, so I'm going to do this with a light pencil. And I may have to, as I go through, go back and forth between whether or not I use a light pencil or a darker one to make my marks. So go ahead and do this on every spot, and basically what we're doing is we're extending this line. The line doesn't need to be here in the middle, it just needs to be here on the edge, because that's where we're going to line up the seam. There we go. And you just want it inside that seam allowance because it doesn't need to be anywhere beyond that seam allowance. Now when we go to grab our row that is above this one, so these two are going to come together like this. When we put this right sides together, this time we're going to pin each end, but instead of finding the middle, we're going to find where that seam lines up with that mark and pin right there. And so we're going to be pinning at every single one of these seams, lining up that mark that we made with the vertical sashing seam. And that will allow all of our lines to just line right up and not be shifty in the finished quilt. Alright, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and add all my rows together to make the center of the quilt with my top and bottom border one already attached. We're going to come back and add our side border ones. And once we've added our side border ones, then we'll get to add our border 2, and the quilt's complete. At this point, sometimes I like to figure out how many seams I have left. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seams. 9 seams, and the whole quilt will be done. Now they're long seams, so they're going to take a minute, but it's just 9 more seams. If you think about how many seams are in this quilt total, and I haven't done that math, if you want to, feel free, go ahead, leave in the comments how many total seams we did in this quilt. There's just 9 left. That's really small, friends. We're almost there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do this seam, and then 2 more, and then we'll be back to do the 2 for the side borders. Next step is to put on our border one side pieces, and we're going to do this the same way that we did these pieces when we first attached them to the top, which is pin on both sides, pin in the middle, and then pin in between to ease that out. Now if you squared up your blocks and all of them were 12.5 inches, all of this should go together perfectly with no problems. But let's be real here, we're not all perfect, and sometimes there can be some significant changes or differences that happen. So if you're concerned about the length of your side borders, if they're generally speaking, these would be much longer if you're off. So if you just measure them up against and see that there's quite a bit of extra border when you measure this up against your quilt top, then you can actually shorten your border one pieces, and you're going to do the same thing with your border two pieces when you put them on. And here's how we manage that. You're going to measure from top to bottom, in the middle from top to bottom, and then on this edge from top to bottom. So you're going to measure in 3 spots. You're going to add those 3 numbers together, and then you're going to divide by 3. That's going to give you the average of how tall your quilt is across the quilt, because usually it's a little wonky one way or another, right? So once you get the average of those 3 lengths, That's how long you want your border piece to be cut. And you're going to cut both border pieces the same length. It's not that if this one is like 50 and this one's 51, you're going to cut that one 50 and cut that one 51. You would end up cutting them both 50 and a half, assuming that the middle was 50 and a half, to make them the right length. Does that make sense? So that way you can add your border pieces in and ease them, because when you average those out, the pieces that you're going to cut are not going to be exactly the length. So you're going to ease them in just the same way that we eased these in as we were putting them in, and that is going to help your quilt to come back to square. And then when we go to add the top and bottom pieces, you're going to do the same thing. Measure the top, the middle, the bottom, and that's how long your top and bottom border two pieces are going to be. And then you're going to again measure the sides, both sides and the middle, add it together, average it by 3, or divide it by 3 to get the average, and do your side borders. And that's going to help bring your quilt back to square if you've had any issues throughout. Now we could have done that with our top and bottom as well as our long sashing pieces as well if we wanted, but hopefully your blocks are pretty close to 12.5 inches when we squared them up, and so this is kind of just interesting but moot and not something you need to do. Okay, well, we've done this step before where we pin on our pieces on each end, in the middle, and several times along the length to kind of ease anything that needs easing. So we're going to go ahead and do that with these side borders, and then when I come back, we're going to chat border 2. We have our blocks together with our sashing, we have our border 1, and now it's time to add border 2, which is really going to bring this whole quilt all together. So really is the same thing we've done before, adding the borders to the top and bottom, just like we did with the sashing, and then to the two sides. It's actually even easier now because we don't have to worry about these seams on the blocks going flippy as we're sewing these on. It does get a little tricky in that it's a lot of bulk and a lot of fabric to have under the machine. So go slow and just make sure that you're adjusting the quilt so that if you're feeling gravity pull the quilt towards you, bring as much of the quilt up onto your tabletop as you can, and that will keep it from coming towards you. If you need to move your machine to make it easier, like put your machine further back so that you can pull more of it in front of the machine to help out. Or I like to sometimes sandwich the quilt between my tummy here and the edge of the table, and that helps pinch it so that it doesn't slide down. Because really your only challenge in doing all this is going to be the weight of the quilt fighting you. But other than that, it's so simple. So we're going to pin our top and bottom borders, stitch those on, pin our two side borders, stitch those on, and then I'll be back to close this out. After adding each of the borders, go ahead and press your seams out. There it is, the quilt top is done. You can see that blue border is perfect for just framing the whole quilt and really pulling all the blue from the blocks and making everything pop. So excited. I think it turned out so good. It's always a mystery, you know, when you're working on a quilt, like, is it really going to turn out the way it is in my head? And when it does, it's so fun. The next step is to quilt it. Now you can quilt it yourself. You can try a quilt as you go style when piecing this together if you want. You can send it to a long armer. I have a long arm here, so I'm actually going to put this on my long arm and long arm it myself. And then I'm going to add the binding. For the binding, I'm going to use the AGF 2.5 edition binding that was designed for the Ink Perfect line. So it's going to be fabulous adding that binding to this. And then for the backing, I have another linen from the Ink Perfect line that has big circles on it, a shibori dye looking quilt fabric that is going to be so perfect for the back of this quilt. And yeah, so quilting it, binding it with the 2.5 edition, and then this quilt will be done. I hope that you enjoyed this process here in 2025 making this quilt. I hope you've had a fabulous year and that you've loved doing those bonus blocks. This has been really fun for me as well. If you're not already subscribed, friends, I don't know what's stopping you. Hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Let me know where you're at with this quilt. I always love knowing where people are at with their block of the month quilt. Make sure you've given this video a thumbs up, and friends, I will see you right here real soon as we start the 2026 block of the month. Bye for now, my friends.